Ella had always been different. While her siblings argued over numbers, finances, and business plans at the family dinner table, she would get lost staring out the window, imagining stories born from a butterfly's flight or the whisper of the wind through the leaves. Her family affectionately called her the dreamer, but deep down, Ella knew they didn't truly understand the depth of her inner world. Each morning, when the sun bathed the walls of her room in gold, Ella woke up with new ideas dancing in her mind. She wrote in a worn-out journal she had inherited from her grandmother, filling pages with thoughts that seemed to come from some mysterious place within her soul. Her words flowed like crystal water, creating worlds where true love existed and happy endings weren't just fantasies. Her mother, a practical woman who had built a successful family business, watched Ella with a mix of pride and concern. "Mija, your dreams are beautiful, but you need to think about your future," she would say while making breakfast. "Dreams don't pay the bills." But Ella couldn't change who she was. Her heart beat to the rhythm of untold stories, and her eyes sparkled with the hope that one day, someone would understand the secret language of her soul. University had been a compromise. She studied literature because it was the closest thing to her passion, but classrooms filled with technical analysis and complex theories didn't nourish her creative spirit. She longed for something more authentic, something that resonated with her heart's frequency. In the afternoons, after classes, she wandered the city streets, seeking inspiration in the faces of passers-by, in the fragmented conversations she overheard at cafes, in the colors the sunset painted across old buildings. It was in those moments of solitude that Ella felt most connected to herself. She walked with no destination, letting her feet guide her to unknown places. There was something magical about getting lost in her own city, discovering corners that had always been there but she had never noticed. Her steps took her down cobbled streets where colonial houses stood as silent witnesses to stories of the past. During those walks, Ella developed the habit of writing in her mind. She would see an elderly couple sharing ice cream and imagine an entire love story that had lasted decades. She'd see a little girl playing with her dog and dream up fantastic adventures where they saved the world together. It was as if the universe whispered stories to her constantly, and she had been chosen as the channel to bring them to life. Her family didn't understand this constant need to create. "Ella lives in the clouds," her older brother would say, a successful accountant who had taken over the family business. "She needs to get her feet on the ground." But for Ella, flying among the clouds was where she felt truly at home. It was there, in the space between reality and dreams, that her soul felt free. Nights were her most productive time. When the house fell silent and only the light from her desk lamp lit her little haven, Ella would write with a passion that surprised even herself. Her fingers flew over the keys of her old laptop, bringing to life characters that seemed to have minds of their own. She wrote about impossible loves, about soulmates who found each other after lifetimes of searching, about the magic that existed in chance encounters. But something deeply unsettled her. Sometimes, when she wrote, she had the strange feeling that someone else was reading her words as she created them. It was as if an invisible presence were connected to her creative process, understanding every nuance of her emotions, every turn of her thoughts. She had felt this sensation since she was little, but it had grown stronger over time. Her university friends admired her creativity but saw her as someone unreachable. "She lives in her own world," they'd say, not realizing that for her, that world was more real than reality itself. She had tried to explain how stories called to her, how she felt a special mission to give voice to emotions others couldn't express, but her words were met with confused looks and polite smiles. Her grandmother's journal had become her closest confidant. Between its yellowed pages, Ella poured not just her stories but also her deepest fears. She feared she would never find someone who understood the language of her heart, that she would always be seen as the family dreamer, the one detached from reality. But even so, she couldn't change who she was. Her essence was too intertwined with the need to create, to feel, to love intensely. It was during one of these introspective afternoons, after a particularly frustrating class on modern narrative techniques, that Ella decided to take a different route home. Her feet led her down streets she had never explored, to an old neighborhood where second-hand bookstores and bohemian cafes were tucked between historic buildings. It was there, when she least expected it, that she found the place that would change her life forever. The bookstore appeared before her as if it had sprung from a fairy tale. Hidden between two modern buildings, the small shop seemed to have resisted the passage of time with quiet dignity. Its moss-green wooden facade was adorned with ivy climbing toward the second floor, and a golden sign with elegant lettering read, "Books and Dreams, Antique Bookstore." Ella stopped in front of the window display, fascinated by the collection of books showcased like precious treasures. There were first editions of classics with worn leather covers, volumes of poetry with yellowed pages that seemed to whisper ancient secrets, and manuscripts holding stories from times long gone. The warm light emanating from inside created a cozy atmosphere that invited her in, as if the place had been waiting for her arrival. As she pushed open the glass door, a small bell announced her entry with a sweet, nostalgic chime that seemed to echo somewhere deep in her memory. The scent of old paper and ink blended with the subtle perfume of dried flowers decorating the shelves, creating an olfactory symphony that transported her immediately to a world where time moved more slowly, where every book held a story not just in its pages, but in its very existence. The dark wood shelves towered from floor to ceiling, forming narrow aisles that invited exploration. Ella walked among them with reverence, running her fingers along the spines of the books, feeling the textures of worn leather and faded cloth. Each section seemed to have its own personality. Classic literature held the place of honor near the main window, bathed in sunlight that made the golden dust sparkle in the air, while poetry nestled in an intimate corner illuminated by an antique brass lamp. The philosophy section occupied a solemn space near the entrance, with thick volumes that seemed to contain answers to all the existential questions humanity had ever asked. Art books were spread out on a low table, opened to reveal reproductions of masterpieces that seemed to come alive under the bookstore's soft lighting. There was something magical about the way each book seemed to be in exactly the right place, as if it had arrived there by destiny. But it was in the contemporary literature section that Ella found something that left her breathless. A thin book with a cobalt blue cover glowed among the other titles, as if lit by an inner light. When she picked it up, she felt a strange sense of familiarity, as if she had already read it in some forgotten dream. The title, Letters to a Soulmate, was written in silver letters that shifted intensity depending on the light's angle. The synopsis told of a young writer searching for her voice in a world that didn't understand her, someone who wrote letters to a love she hadn't met yet, but who she felt existed somewhere in the universe. Something in those words resonated so deeply within her that Ella felt tears threaten to well up. It was as if someone had written her story without ever knowing her, as if her most intimate thoughts had been poured onto pages she had never seen before. She opened the book at random and read a line that made her tremble. "I write these words knowing that somewhere, someone is reading them with the heart I'm searching for." It was impossible. Those words were eerily similar to something she had written in her journal just the night before. She turned several more pages, and on each one she found thoughts that felt as though they had been lifted straight from her soul. The silence of the bookstore grew deeper as she continued reading, lost in a world she recognized as her own but had never created. The other customers moved through a parallel reality, their voices fading into distant murmurs as she immersed herself in pages that spoke her heart's language with a precision that terrified and thrilled her at the same time. There were passages about creative loneliness that described exactly what she felt during her late-night writing sessions. There were reflections on the search for true love that mirrored her inner monologues. There were descriptions of feeling connected to something greater than oneself, something she had experienced, but never been able to express. She hadn't noticed anyone watching her from the counter until a soft voice interrupted her concentration. "It's a beautiful story," said the man, and his voice had a quality that made her look up immediately. "It's about finding your own voice when the world seems to speak a different language." Ella looked up, and her eyes met those of a stranger who was smiling at her, as though he already knew all her secrets. There was something in his expression that made her feel this encounter was no accident, that something deeper was unfolding in that moment. The book still trembled in her hands, and she realized she had been holding her breath. "It's strange," she murmured, clutching the book to her chest. "It's like I've been waiting to find this my whole life." The man nodded, and in his green eyes she saw a glimmer of understanding that made her feel that, for the first time, someone truly understood what she meant. The man behind the counter was not what Ella had expected to find in an old bookstore. He looked to be in his 30s, with slightly messy brown hair that gave him a bohemian yet elegant air. His green eyes sparkled with a calm intelligence that seemed to see beyond the surface, as if he could read the thoughts hidden behind unspoken words. He wore a cream-colored wool sweater that looked soft to the touch and worn jeans that suggested comfort over formality. There was something about his presence that radiated serenity and deep knowledge, as if he had read every book in the store and extracted the essential wisdom from each one. His hands, now arranging a few volumes on the counter, moved with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime handling paper and ink with love and respect. Small scars on his fingers told stories of years spent among books, tending to them with care. "I'm Mateo," he introduced himself, extending a hand that Ella shook with slight hesitation. His grip was firm but gentle, and it lasted a moment longer than socially necessary, as if both had recognized something familiar in the other. "I'm the keeper of this little cavern of literary treasures." His voice had a warm and melodic tone that made her feel immediately at ease, like he was an old friend who had been waiting for her visit for years. "Ella," she replied, and noticed how her name sounded different in that magical space, as if it had gained a deeper meaning. "I've never seen this bookstore before. It's like it appeared out of nowhere." As she said it, she realized it was literally true. She had walked down that street hundreds of times, but she had never noticed the bookstore's presence. Mateo smiled, and Ella noticed how the corners of his eyes crinkled slightly, giving him a wise and kind appearance that made her feel safe. "Sometimes special things only appear when we're ready to find them," he said, and there was something in his voice that suggested he knew exactly what he was talking about. "Places like this have lives of their own. They choose their visitors as much as visitors choose them." As he spoke, Mateo continued arranging the books on the counter, but Ella noticed that his movements weren't random. It seemed like he was creating a specific order, as if preparing something special. His fingers moved over the covers with a familiarity that suggested he knew each book like an old friend. "Tell me," he said, looking up at her, "what kind of stories do you like? I can see in your eyes that you're a passionate reader." There was something in the way he looked at her that made her feel truly seen, more than she had ever felt before. It wasn't the superficial gaze of her classmates or her family, it was something deeper, as if he could see straight into her soul. Ella found herself speaking with a fluency that surprised her. The words poured out of her as if they had been waiting for the right person to be released. She told him about her love for stories about true love, her search for characters who felt emotions as intensely as she did, her desire to find books that spoke to her soul instead of just her mind. "I like stories that make me feel like I'm not alone in the world," she admitted, surprising herself with her honesty. "I look for characters who understand what it means to love with your whole heart, who know that sometimes emotions are more real than reality itself." As she spoke, she noticed that Mateo listened with an attention that went far beyond professional courtesy. Mateo nodded occasionally, and every gesture seemed to confirm that he understood not just what she was saying, but also what she couldn't express with words. "I understand completely," he finally said. "You're searching for stories that validate your way of seeing the world, that confirm that feeling deeply isn't a weakness but a gift." The accuracy of his insight took her breath away. "Exactly," she whispered, feeling that for the first time in her life someone had managed to translate her feelings into clear words. "My family thinks I'm too much of a dreamer, that I need to be more practical. But I can't change how my heart responds to the world." "Dreamers are the bravest people there are," Mateo replied, and in his voice there was a conviction that made her feel he spoke from personal experience. "It takes courage to keep your heart open in a world that constantly tries to harden it." There was a comfortable silence between them, during which Ella felt understood in a way she had never experienced before. It was as if they had been having this conversation for years, as if they had always known each other. The connection was so intense that she found it difficult to hold his gaze, yet at the same time, she couldn't look away. "I think I have something perfect for you," Mateo finally said, walking toward a bookshelf that Ella hadn't noticed before. It was smaller than the others, tucked away in a quiet corner, partially hidden by a curtain of green velvet. The books it held seemed to glow with a soft, mysterious light, as if they were enchanted objects rather than simple volumes. "This is my special collection," he explained, and there was reverence in his voice. "Books that arrive here through mysterious paths, stories that find exactly the reader who needs them." His fingers moved over several titles before settling on one. Mateo selected a red leather-bound volume that seemed to pulse with life and handed it to Ella. "This book arrived just a few weeks ago," he said, and she noticed a trace of emotion in his voice. "There's no known author, but the stories inside are special. Each person who reads it finds something different in its pages, something that speaks directly to their heart." Ella took the book with trembling hands, and the moment she touched it, she felt an electric current rush through her body. It was as if the book had been waiting for her touch, as if it had been made specifically for her. When she opened the first page, the words seemed to shimmer and move, as if they were alive. "That's curious," Mateo murmured, watching her reaction with eyes bright with emotion. "I had the feeling someone would come for it. For weeks, every time I looked at this shelf, I felt that book calling out to me, as if it were telling me to wait. And here you are." Their eyes met again, and in that moment, Ella felt that something fundamental had shifted in her world. It wasn't just the book or the bookstore, it was the way this man seemed to understand something essential about her without even knowing her. It was as if they had been destined to meet, as if her entire life had been a preparation for this moment. The days that followed turned into a routine Ella looked forward to from the moment she opened her eyes each morning. The bookstore had become a magnet pulling her in with a force she couldn't explain or resist. Every afternoon after her classes, she made her way to Books and Dreams as if called by an inner voice she could no longer ignore. Her steps would quicken unconsciously as she approached the now familiar street, and her heart would beat faster with a sense of anticipation that startled her by its intensity. Mateo was always there, as though he never left his place behind the counter. His face would light up with a genuine smile each time he saw her walk through the door, and that smile had become the highlight of Ella's day. There was something about his presence that calmed her and thrilled her at once, like finding a refuge where she could be completely herself, without fear, without masks. What was most extraordinary was that Mateo seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of her emotional states that defied all logic. If she arrived feeling melancholic after a family argument about her academic future, he would hand her a book of poetry that spoke of finding one's identity in the midst of others' expectations. If she came in anxious about her upcoming university exams, he would magically appear with a novel about a young woman discovering her true calling after navigating a period of uncertainty. The first book he had given her, Letters to a Soulmate, had become her constant companion. She carried it in her bag wherever she went, and every time she opened it, she found new passages that resonated perfectly with her current mood. It was as though the book evolved with her, revealing new layers of meaning depending on what her heart needed. "How do you do it?" she asked him one afternoon, after he had recommended a story that seemed written specifically to answer the questions she'd been grappling with all week. She had arrived with a heavy heart, burdened by the feeling she'd never find her place in the world, and he had handed her a story about a writer who discovered that her uniqueness was her greatest strength. Mateo gave her that mysterious smile she had come to recognize and expect. His green eyes sparkled with a secret that always hovered just out of reach. "Let's just say I've learned to read between the lines," he said, arranging some new books that had arrived that morning. "Books have lives of their own, and sometimes, they simply know who they belong to." His fingers moved with an almost ritual precision as he organized the volumes, as if performing a sacred ceremony. Ella noticed that each book seemed to find its perfect spot without effort, as if he had a mental map of where every story was meant to go. "Besides," he added, glancing up at her, "there's something special about you. It's like the stories you need are already written in your soul." The intensity of his gaze made her feel exposed but not vulnerable, like he could see all her secrets but treated them with the respect they deserved. There was something in the way he spoke that suggested he knew far more than he let on, as though he carried ancient knowledge that he was not quite ready to share. But it was during her 5th visit that something truly inexplicable happened. Ella was flipping through a collection of Latin American short stories, lost in a tale of magical realism, when she suddenly felt an overwhelming and irresistible urge to write. Without thinking, she grabbed a scrap of paper from the counter and began scribbling, letting the words flow from a place deep within her consciousness. She wrote about a young woman wandering unknown streets, searching for something she didn't know she'd lost, about encounters that seemed accidental but had been written in the stars since the beginning of time. Her fingers moved with a speed that startled her, as if someone else were guiding her hand. The words appeared on the page with a fluidity she had never experienced before. When she finally stopped, she realized she had written several pages without even noticing. But what left her completely frozen was hearing Mateo whispering the exact same words she had written, at the same time she wrote them. His voice was barely audible, but clear enough for her to recognize that he was reciting, word for word, what her hand had just placed on the paper. She turned toward him, eyes wide with awe and a hint of fear. Mateo was standing behind the counter, eyes closed, his lips moving in perfect synchrony with the words she had just written. When the final line left her pen, he opened his eyes slowly and looked at her with a mixture of surprise and recognition. "How?" she began, but the question died in her throat. The moment was too surreal to process with reason. There was a connection between them that defied all logical explanation, something beyond coincidence or chance. Mateo approached slowly, as if afraid to startle her. I felt it too," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "As you wrote, the words appeared in my mind as if someone were dictating them to me. It's as if we're connected in a way I don't fully understand." Ella looked at the paper in her hands, then at him, then back again. The words were still there, in her handwriting, but the experience of writing them felt shared, like they had been co-authors of something beautiful and mysterious. "This isn't normal," she murmured, though there was no fear in her voice, only wonder. "No," Mateo agreed. "It's not normal. But maybe, normal isn't what we need." They stood in silence for a moment, both trying to process what had happened. The bookstore seemed even quieter than usual, as if the books themselves were listening, waiting, to see what would come next. "Have you ever experienced anything like this before?" Ella asked, her voice barely a whisper. Mateo shook his head, but there was something in his expression that suggested it wasn't entirely true. "Never like this," he finally said. "But I've always felt that something special was waiting for me. And now, I think I know what it was." The night after the shared writing moment, Ella couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, reliving again and again the moment Mateo had spoken her words at the exact time she had written them. There was something profoundly unsettling and beautiful about that inexplicable connection, as if they had touched something sacred, something that existed beyond ordinary comprehension. The next day, she walked into the bookstore with a determination that surprised even herself. She needed answers. She needed to understand what was happening between them. But when she pushed open the door and heard the familiar chime of the bell, she found the bookstore completely empty. There was no sign of Mateo anywhere, and the silence was so deep that she could hear the beating of her own heart. She walked to the counter, hoping to find a note or some explanation for his absence. But what she found instead left her breathless. There was a book lying open in the exact spot where she had written the day before. It was one she had never seen. Its pages looked like old parchment, and its cover shimmered subtly, changing color depending on how the light hit it. As she approached, she saw that the book was open to a page containing the very words she had written the day before. But it wasn't a copy. It was as if her thoughts had been magically printed on pages that seemed to be hundreds of years old. Her fingers trembled as she flipped through it, discovering more and more of her own words, thoughts she had written in secret diaries, dreams she had never shared with anyone. "It's incredible, isn't it?" said a voice behind her. Ella spun around sharply and found Mateo stepping out from between the tall shelves. But something about him had changed. His presence felt more intense, more luminous, like he had shed a disguise he had worn until now. "What is this?" she asked, gesturing toward the book with trembling hands. "How are my words in a book that looks centuries old?" Her voice cracked slightly, a mix of wonder and growing fear of the unknown. Mateo approached slowly, as if moving toward a wild animal that might bolt at any moment. "Ella," he said softly, "there's something I need to tell you. Something that's going to sound impossible, but you need to hear it to understand what's happening between us. His green eyes shimmered with a light that seemed to come from within. This book, he said, placing his hand gently on the parchment, is the record of soulmates who have found each other across time. Every true love story that's ever existed, every deep connection between two destined souls, is written here. Ella took a step back, the foundations of her world beginning to shake beneath her feet. That's impossible, she whispered, but even as she said it, she knew she was experiencing something that defied all the rules of reality she had ever known. Look at the first page, Mateo said, gently opening the book to its beginning. Read the inscription. With trembling fingers, Ella followed his suggestion and read aloud. For those who write from the heart and find their words in the soul of another. For those who search every book for the story that already lives inside them. You've been writing these stories your entire life, Mateo explained, his voice filled with emotion. Every time you wrote about true love, every time you imagined perfect encounters between soulmates, you were channeling real stories. And I've been waiting for you longer than you can imagine. Mateo's words rang through the air like ancient bells. Ella felt her legs weaken and leaned against the counter to keep her balance. Who are you really? She asked, though a part of her already suspected the truth. I'm the guardian of these stories, he answered, and as he spoke, his appearance seemed to shift subtly. It wasn't that he looked different, it was that his presence now carried the weight of something timeless, something eternal. For generations I've protected this place, waiting for the one who could not only read these stories, but live them, write them, complete them. Ella looked back down at the book, flipping through pages that showed love stories from different eras and cultures, yet all with the same essence she recognized from her own writing. And you think I'm that person, she said, not as a question, but as a realization slowly settling in her mind. I don't think, Mateo said, stepping closer. I know. From the moment you walked in, from the moment you touched the first book, I knew you were the one I've been waiting for. Your soul recognizes these stories because you're part of them. You are the finisher, the one who can complete the unfinished tales. The revelation hit Ella like a tidal wave. Suddenly, everything made sense. Her obsession with love stories, her feeling that someone else was reading her words as she wrote them, the way she had always sensed she was searching for something she couldn't name. But what does that even mean? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Mateo gently took her hands in his, and the moment they touched, a rush of images flooded her mind. She saw the bookstore across centuries. She saw Mateo waiting, year after year. She saw blank pages, waiting to be filled with stories that only she could write. It means, he said, his eyes locked on hers, that we can finally write our own story. The one that's been waiting to be told since the world first dreamed of true love. The book between them began to glow softly, as if responding to the connection growing stronger between them. On its pages, new words started to appear, written in a handwriting that was a perfect blend of theirs. Ella and Mateo's story was beginning to write itself, as if the universe had waited centuries for this moment. And what if I'm not ready? Ella asked, feeling the weight of the responsibility settling on her shoulders. What if I can't do what you expect from me? But even as she spoke her fears, a growing certainty bloomed in her heart. This was why she had always felt different. This was why stories had called to her so intensely. You already are, Mateo said, smiling in a way that lit up the entire bookstore. From the moment you chose to stay true to your dreaming heart, from the moment you chose to write, even when no one understood your need to create, you've been preparing for this. The bell above the door chimed softly, though no one had entered, as if the bookstore itself was celebrating this moment of awakening. Ella looked around and noticed the books glowing faintly, as if each story within them was waking up to a new possibility. Then, she said finally, knowing she was crossing a threshold from which there would be no return, teach me how to write the stories the world needs to read. As she spoke those words, something fundamental stirred within her, like she had finally found the purpose she had been searching for all her life. Mateo smiled, and in his smile, she saw the reflection of her destiny. We'll start with our story, he said, opening the book to a blank page that pulsed with infinite possibility. And from there, the world will read about a love that transcends time and space. From that day on, Ella's life began to shift, gently at first, like the changing of a season. But soon, it felt as though an invisible hand had turned the page of her existence and begun writing a new chapter. Every afternoon, after her university classes, she would return to the bookstore, where time moved differently and reality itself seemed softer, more fluid. Mateo welcomed her each time with the same quiet smile, his eyes sparkling as if he already knew what had happened in her day, even before she spoke. And the book, the glowing ancient book that now held her words, was always waiting, open to the next blank page, inviting her to continue the tale they were co-creating. She no longer questioned the strange energy that pulsed between her fingers and the paper. She simply let herself write. But the more she wrote, the more she noticed something extraordinary. Her stories began to appear elsewhere. First, she found a quote she had written, word for word, on a poster hanging in the hallway of her university. Then, a short story she had composed weeks earlier showed up in a literary magazine she had never submitted to. Friends from different parts of the country began sending her messages. "I read something that reminded me so much of you. Are you writing under a pseudonym?" At first, she thought it was coincidence. But when she confronted Mateo with the eerie repetition of her words, he simply nodded, his voice calm and knowing. "The stories are finding their way into the world. Once you write them here, they begin to echo beyond this place. They're not meant to stay only between these pages. They belong to the souls who are waiting to remember them." Ella felt both terrified and honored by the responsibility. "But why me?" she asked one day, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Why can't someone else finish the stories?" Mateo paused, his gaze distant, as if remembering a time long before she had been born. "Because only those whose hearts speak the language of the endings can complete what others left behind. The world is full of beginnings. It's rare to find someone who can write a true ending, one that heals, that closes the circle with truth, love, and meaning." Ella took a breath and closed her eyes. She knew he was right. She had always feared endings. But now she was learning that endings were not about loss, but about fulfillment. Still, questions kept surfacing in her heart. One evening, as a light rain tapped gently on the bookstore windows, she finally asked what had been haunting her since the beginning. "How did my words appear in the book before I ever wrote them? That first day, when I found that blue book, the one that told my story, it had my thoughts before I ever shared them." Mateo was silent for a long moment. Then, softly, he walked to a small cabinet behind the counter and retrieved something wrapped in velvet. He handed it to her carefully. Ella opened the cloth and revealed a small, golden key, delicate, old, and warm to the touch. Attached to it was a tag that read, "For the one who writes what has already been written." "There is a room behind this store," Mateo said. "Locked for everyone but you. The key chooses its owner. Inside that room, you'll find the origin of your connection to this place." Her hands trembled as she took the key. The walls of the bookstore seemed to grow still, as if the books were holding their breath. Mateo guided her to the back of the shop, where a narrow staircase led down to a door hidden behind stacks of forgotten volumes. The lock gleamed softly under the lantern light. Ella inserted the key. It turned with a gentle click, as if it had been waiting for this moment for centuries. The door opened with a sigh. Inside was a circular room filled with books that shimmered with golden edges and ink that glowed faintly under the low light. But at the center stood a single pedestal, and on it, a mirror. Ella approached, expecting to see her reflection. But what she saw was different. She saw herself, yes, but younger. Writing. A child, barely 7, scribbling in a notebook with wild, emotional urgency. Then she saw herself at 12, at 16, always writing, always dreaming, always pouring her soul into pages no one else seemed to understand. And behind each image, standing just out of focus, was him. Mateo. Watching. Waiting. "You've always been connected to the stories," he said behind her. And you've always been connected to me. Ella turned toward him, her heart racing. But how? How is this possible? Time bends in places where love is strong enough, Mateo said softly. Some souls are drawn together across lifetimes by a shared mission, a shared melody. Ours is to remember the stories, to give them endings. That's why you felt my presence even as a child. I've been here, on the edge of your words, waiting for the day you would find your way back. She felt tears gather in her eyes, not out of fear, but recognition. This wasn't madness. This was memory. The day you found the blue book wasn't the first time we met, he said gently. It was the first time you were ready to remember. Ella stepped back, overwhelmed by the enormity of it all. Her life, her dreams, her stories, none of them had been random. They had all been guiding her to this. She looked down at the mirror again and saw one final image. Herself, sitting across from Mateo in the bookstore, both of them writing side by side, a new story forming between them. That hasn't happened yet, she said. Not exactly, Mateo replied. But now it can. Ella felt the weight of the key still in her hand. But it no longer felt heavy, it felt right. She returned to the main room of the bookstore, the mirror image still glowing in her mind, and opened the great book once again. The blank page shimmered, welcoming her return. Mateo joined her, sitting quietly beside her, his presence calm and grounding. She dipped her pen in ink and wrote. There once was a girl who wrote with her soul, and found someone who could read her heart before she ever spoke. And the page began to glow. From that moment on, writing was no longer something Ella did alone. Each day, she and Mateo met at the round table near the stained glass window, where golden light filtered through colored panes and painted their notebooks with soft hues of blue and rose. The great book sat open between them, no longer a mystery, but a companion, a living entity that responded to their emotions, to their memories, and to something even deeper, the call of unfinished love stories waiting to be completed. They discovered that each page they touched revealed a fragment of a love story that had once existed but had never found closure. Some were tender and tragic, others full of longing or quiet courage. They came from all over the world, from different centuries, different cultures, but all carried the same thread, two souls meant for each other, lost in time. Ella would read the fragment, often no longer than a paragraph, and feel the ache of its incompletion. Mateo, silently beside her, would offer only a glance, and somehow, it was enough. The rest of the story would pour out of her, as if it had lived inside her forever. The first was a woman in 18th-century France who wrote secret letters to a soldier she met only once but never stopped loving. The second, a young man in ancient Persia who carved poetry into stone walls, hoping his beloved would one day return and read it. Another told of two girls in 1940s Buenos Aires, torn apart by family expectations, whose final words had never been spoken. Ella cried through many of them. But as she wrote, the pain always gave way to peace. The endings she wrote were never perfect, they weren't about happy ever afters. They were about truth. About giving voice to what had been silenced. About honoring the connection between souls who had once found each other, even if only briefly. These are not fiction, Mateo told her one evening, as she finished another story. They're memories. Pieces of lives lived by real people, now written into the book so their essence won't be lost. But why are we the ones to finish them? Ella asked. Because you're one of them, he replied simply. You were once part of a story that never reached its end. Ella went still. Which story? Mateo hesitated. His eyes, usually steady, flickered with emotion. Ours. She stared at him, her breath caught between hope and disbelief. In a different life long ago, he continued, you and I were separated before we could speak what we felt. I remembered you through the stories. That's why I became the keeper of this place. I waited until the day you would walk in again. And now? She asked, voice trembling. Now we're writing our ending. One word at a time. Ella's heart thudded in her chest. All her life, she had written about soulmates, about invisible bonds, echoes across time, destinies intertwined. And now, the idea that she was one of those stories, that Mateo had known and loved her before, was too beautiful and impossible to fully hold. But it felt true. And so, she kept writing. Weeks passed, and the book grew fuller with each day. Sometimes, after finishing a story, the pages shimmered and gently turned themselves, as if satisfied. Other times, they left unfinished lines, inviting Mateo to write the final words with her. And when he did, their sentences blended so naturally that it was impossible to tell which hand had written which part. The connection between them grew stronger with each tale. They could feel each other's emotions like ripples on the surface of shared water. When she doubted herself, he would silently place his hand over hers, and the words would return. When he grew quiet and distant, lost in some invisible pain, she would write something just for him, and he would smile again. One evening, as the rain poured gently outside, they came across a page unlike the others. It was blank, except for one line written in glowing ink. "This is the story that will change everything." They looked at each other. Ella's fingers hovered above the page, hesitant. "What do you think it means?" she asked. Mateo leaned closer. "I don't know. But I think this one is ours." She swallowed. For the first time, she wasn't sure she could write. What if this story required more than just words? What if it required a choice? She closed her eyes, searching her heart. Then, slowly, she began to write. There were two souls, destined again and again to find each other. But each time they met, they had to decide whether love was worth the risk of remembering everything. She paused. "Do you think we've done this before? Found each other, written together, then forgotten?" "I think we've always found each other," Mateo said, softly. "But this time, we have the chance to stay." Her heart ached at the thought. How? When the stories are done, what happens then? Do I stay? Or do I disappear like the others? Mateo reached out and took her hand. "We don't know. But maybe, we write the ending ourselves. Maybe this time, we choose something new." Ella looked down at their hands, interlaced like sentences in perfect rhythm. The warmth of his touch grounded her, but also filled her with something daring, hope. She wrote one more line. They decided to stay awake in the dream, even if the world tried to forget them. And the page glowed so brightly that the room filled with light. In that moment, they both knew. Their story wasn't about endings. It was about beginning again, with full memory, full heart, and daring to write what no one else had written before. The following days became a routine that Ella eagerly anticipated from the moment she opened her eyes each morning. The bookstore had become a magnet, pulling her with a force she couldn't explain or resist. Every afternoon after classes, she headed to Books and Dreams, as if summoned by an inner voice she could not ignore. Her steps quickened unconsciously as she approached the familiar street, and her heart beat with an anticipation that surprised her with its intensity. Mateo was always there, as if he never left his post behind the counter. His face lit up with a genuine smile every time he saw her enter, and that smile had become the highlight of Ella's days. There was something about his presence that calmed and excited her at the same time, as if she had found a refuge where she could be completely herself without fear of judgment. The most extraordinary thing was that he seemed to possess an intuitive knowledge of her emotional states that defied all logic. If she arrived melancholic after a family argument about her academic future, Mateo would hand her a book of poems about finding one's identity amidst others' expectations. If she came restless due to the pressure of university exams, he would magically appear with a novel about a young woman discovering her true purpose after a period of uncertainty. The first book he had recommended, Letters to a Soulmate, had become her constant companion. She carried it everywhere in her bag, and each time she opened it, she found new passages that perfectly resonated with her mood at the moment. It was as if the book evolved with her, revealing different layers of meaning according to her emotional needs. "How do you do it?" she asked one afternoon, after he recommended a book that seemed written specifically to answer the questions she had been asking herself all week. She had arrived at the bookstore with a heavy heart, feeling she would never find her place in the world, and he handed her a story about a writer who discovered her difference was her greatest strength. Mateo smiled with that mysterious expression she had come to know and expect. His green eyes gleamed with a secret that seemed on the verge of being revealed but was always carefully guarded. "Let's say I've learned to read between the lines," he replied, organizing some new books that had arrived that morning. Books have a life of their own, and sometimes, they just know who they belong to. His fingers moved with almost ritual precision as he arranged the volumes, as if performing a sacred ceremony. She noticed that every book seemed to find its perfect place effortlessly, as if he had a mental map of where each story belonged. "Besides," he continued, looking up at her, "there's something special about you. It's like you carry the stories you need to read written in your soul." The intensity of his gaze made her feel exposed but not vulnerable, as if he could see all her secrets but treated them with the respect they deserved. There was something in the way he spoke that suggested he knew far more than he said, as if he kept deep knowledge he wasn't ready to fully share. But it was during her 5th visit that something truly inexplicable happened. She was flipping through a collection of Latin American short stories, lost in a tale of magical realism, when she felt a sudden and irresistible need to write. Without thinking, she began scribbling on a piece of paper she found on the counter, letting words flow from some deep place within her consciousness. She wrote about a young woman walking unknown streets searching for something she didn't know she had lost, about encounters that seemed casual but had been written in the stars since the beginning of time. Her fingers moved at a speed that surprised her, as if someone else was guiding her hand. The words appeared on the paper with a fluidity she had never experienced before. When she finally stopped, she realized she had written several pages without even noticing. But what completely paralyzed her was hearing Mateo whisper the exact same words she had written, at the same time she wrote them. His voice was barely audible, but clear enough for her to distinguish that he was reciting exactly what her fingers were putting on paper. She turned toward him with wide eyes filled with amazement and a bit of fear. Mateo was standing behind the counter, eyes closed, moving his lips in perfect synchronization with the words she had written. When he finished the last sentence, he slowly opened his eyes and looked at her with an expression mixing surprise and recognition. "How?" Ella began to ask, but the words died in her throat. The situation was too surreal to be processed rationally. There was a connection between them that defied all logical explanation, something beyond coincidence or chance. Mateo approached slowly, as if not to scare her. "I felt it too," he admitted, his voice trembling slightly. "While you wrote, the words appeared in my mind as if someone was dictating them to me. It's like we're connected in a way I don't understand." Ella looked at the paper in her hands, then at him, and then back to the paper. The words were still there, written in her handwriting, but the experience of having created them felt shared, as if they had co-authored something beautiful and mysterious. "This isn't normal," she whispered, but there was no fear in her voice, only wonder. "No," Mateo agreed. "It's not normal. But maybe normal isn't what we need." They remained silent for a moment, processing what had happened. The bookstore seemed to grow even quieter, as if the books themselves were watching and waiting to see what would come next. "Have you experienced anything like this before?" Ella asked, her voice barely a whisper. Mateo shook his head, but there was something in his expression that suggested it wasn't entirely true. "Not like this," he finally said. "But I have always felt that something special was waiting for me. And now I think I know what it was." The night after the shared writing incident, Ella couldn't sleep. She lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling and reliving over and over the moment Mateo recited her words at the same time she wrote them. There was something deeply unsettling but also beautiful about that inexplicable connection, as if they had touched something sacred and mysterious that existed beyond normal understanding. The next day, she arrived at the bookstore with a determination that surprised even herself. She needed answers, she needed to understand what was happening between them. But when she pushed the door and heard the familiar chime, she found the bookstore completely empty. There was no sign of Mateo anywhere, and the silence was so deep she could hear her own heartbeat. She went to the counter, hoping to find a note or some explanation for his absence, but what she found left her breathless. There was a book open exactly where she had been writing the day before. The book was one she had never seen before, with pages that looked like ancient parchment and a cover that changed color depending on the light. Approaching it, she realized the book was open to a page containing exactly the words she had written the previous day. But it wasn't a copy. It was as if her thoughts had magically appeared printed on pages that seemed centuries old. Her fingers trembled as she flipped through the pages, discovering more and more of her own words, thoughts she had had for years, dreams she had written in her secret diary. "It's incredible, isn't it?" said a voice behind her. Ella spun around abruptly and found Mateo emerging from the shelves, but there was something different about him. His presence seemed more intense, brighter, as if he had shed some kind of disguise he had been wearing. "What is this?" she asked, pointing at the book with trembling hands. "How are my words in a book that looks hundreds of years old?" Her voice cracked slightly, mixing fascination with growing fear of the unknown. Mateo approached slowly, as if approaching a wild animal that might flee at any moment. "Ella," he said softly, "there's something I need to tell you. Something that's going to sound impossible, but you need to know to understand what's happening between us." His green eyes shone with an intensity she had never seen before, as if lit from within. "This book," he continued, placing his hand on the ancient parchment, "is the record of soulmates who have found each other throughout the centuries. Every true love story that has ever existed, every deep connection between two souls destined to meet, appears here." Ella stepped back, feeling the world she knew beginning to crumble around her. "That's impossible," she whispered, but even as she said it, she knew she was experiencing something that defied all the rules of reality she had ever known. "Look at the first page," Mateo gently asked, opening the book to the beginning. "Read the inscription." With trembling fingers, Ella followed his suggestion and read aloud. "For those who write with their hearts and find their words in another's soul, for those who seek in every book the story that already lives within them." "You have been writing these stories your whole life," Mateo explained, his voice full of emotion. "Every time you wrote about true love, every time you imagined perfect soulmate meetings, you were channeling real stories. And I have been waiting for you longer than you can imagine." Mateo's words echoed in the bookstore air like ancient bells. Ella felt her legs weaken and leaned against the counter to keep her balance. "Who are you really?" she asked, though part of her already suspected. "I am the guardian of these stories," he replied, and as he said it, his appearance seemed to subtly change. It wasn't that he looked different physically, but he emanated a presence speaking of years, perhaps centuries, of knowledge and purpose. "For generations, I have cared for this place, waiting for the person who could not only read these stories but live them, write them, complete them." Ella looked again at the book, flipping pages showing love stories from different times and cultures, all with the same deep essence she recognized in her own writings. "And you think that person is me," she said, not as a question but as a growing understanding. "I don't think." Mateo stepped closer. "I know. From the moment you came in here, from when you touched the first book, I knew you were the one I had been waiting for. Your soul recognizes these stories because you are part of them. You are the writer of endings, the one who can complete the stories left unfinished." The revelation hit Ella like a huge wave. Suddenly, everything made sense. Her obsession with love stories, her feeling that someone else read her words as she wrote them, the way she always felt she was searching for something she couldn't name. "But what exactly does that mean?" she whispered. Mateo gently took her hands, and at their touch, Ella felt a current of images flowing through her mind. She saw the bookstore through different eras, saw Mateo waiting year after year, saw blank pages waiting to be filled with stories only she could complete. "It means," he said, eyes locked on hers, "that we can finally write our own story. The one that has been waiting to be told since the world began dreaming of true love." His words carried the weight of eternity, but also the promise of a future she had never imagined possible. The book between them began to glow softly, as if responding to the growing connection between them. On its pages, new words started to appear, written in a handwriting that was a perfect blend of both theirs. Ella and Mateo's story was beginning to write itself, as if the universe had been waiting for this moment for eons. "What if I'm not ready?" Ella asked, feeling the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. "What if I can't do what you expect from me?" "You already are," Mateo replied with a smile that lit up the entire bookstore. "From the moment you decided to be true to your dreaming heart, from when you chose to write, even though no one understood your need to create, you have been preparing for this moment." The door chime rang softly, though no one had entered, as if the bookstore itself was celebrating the moment of recognition. Ella looked around and realized the books seemed to shine more brightly, as if every story stored in those pages was awakening to a new possibility. "Then," she said finally, feeling she crossed a threshold with no turning back, teach me how to write the stories the world needs to hear." As she spoke, she felt something fundamental awakening inside her, as if she had finally found the purpose she had been searching for all her life. Mateo smiled, and in that smile she saw the reflection of her own destiny. "We'll start with our story," he said, opening the book to a blank page that seemed to pulse with infinite possibilities. "And from there, the world will read about love that transcends time and space." The sun filtered through the bookstore's ancient windows, casting long shadows over shelves filled with books that seemed to hold millennial secrets. Ella and Mateo sat together in a corner, surrounded by the pages that had helped awaken them and the new stories waiting to be told. "I never imagined my life story would be something so grand," Ella said, a mix of awe and gratitude in her voice. Mateo smiled, his green eyes shining with the wisdom of one who had seen many eras pass. "It's not just your story, Ella. It's the story of all souls who have loved, lost, and found hope throughout time. Our story is just one chapter in an infinite book." Ella looked at the red book, now open on the table, its pages seeming to vibrate with life, as if the ink were fresh and the words continued writing themselves. "Do you think this book will never end?" she asked, gently caressing the cover. "Exactly," Mateo replied. "Because true love, the kind that transcends time and space, is eternal. And as long as there are hearts seeking and words being born, the story will keep writing itself." Ella felt a deep peace. She had finally found her place in the world, a mission giving meaning to every dream, every word written in her diary. "And what will happen to us?" she asked with a shy smile. Mateo took her hands tenderly. "We will keep writing together. Our story, and the stories of all who are yet to come. Because we are guardians of love, storytellers of the soul. And the book will never be complete until every voice is heard." A soft breeze came through the window, flipping the book's pages as if the wind itself wanted to read them. Ella closed her eyes and allowed herself to dream. "So, what are you waiting for?" Mateo said, with a playful spark. "It's time for the world to know the magic we keep." Ella opened her eyes, full of determination. "Let's tell all the stories waiting to be discovered." And so, with hearts intertwined and pens ready to write, they began a new chapter. A chapter with no end, where love and magic are found in every word, every soul, every story yet to be told. Because some stories never end. They only wait to be lived.